Coming up on today's episode of MycoLogic.
It's important for people to understand there are two hazards when it comes to mold. As you know, there's the biological, the actual mold itself, the spores that molds produce, the hyphal fragments, all these things are alive. Now,
Right.
some types of mold, under certain situations, can produce mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are a poisonous chemical. So
Sure.
one is biological, the other one is chemical.
Welcome to MycoLogic. I'm Andi Hembroff.
And I'm Mark Ritacco, president of Respiratory Labs. A little background information about myself. I used to own a mold remediation business in Portland, Oregon. I sold that in 2022. At the time, we were doing about 4,000 mold assessments a year. So I'm really excited with what we're doing here at MycoLogic. And Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I come from the other side of things. I became very ill after purchasing my first home and have dealt with severe mold toxicity. I now work in the industry as an advocate and educator and really happy, really proud to be a part of the Respiratory Labs team.
What's really exciting, Andy, is when I was doing mold assessments or remediation projects, I ran into homeowners like yourself that, were sick. There's something in that home that we couldn't fix. And at the time, we didn't have the ability to evaluate it. There wasn't a lot of education on mycotoxins and the exposure that people were suffering from. And so that led me to be very excited about establishing the lab in order to evaluate that. And that led me into developing what I call the exposure framework, because there's a lot of misalignment when it comes to understanding the different tests, the
Yeah.
different investigations. As you know, you kind of went through that yourself when you were going through your situation. Share a little
I
bit
did.
about that, because I think it's important for people to understand the challenges that you had, because I'm sure people our audience can relate to that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a journey. When we first figured out that it was our environment making me sick, we reached out to a local mold inspector, somebody that had been in the industry for a very long time. And when I hired that individual, I was expecting them to understand mycotoxins, understand how I was being exposed to them. And unfortunately, they did not. So, Mark, you and I were talking the other day, and we had such an interesting conversation that a mold investigation isn't necessarily the same as a mycotoxin exposure investigation. Can you elaborate on that? Because I thought you brought up some really great points.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges and confusions in the industry. And you're not the only person that has gone through that experience. You're thinking that, boy, the indoor environmental professional, they're going to investigate this home for mycotoxins. Well, that's not a traditional mold investigation.
No.
You have to understand how the industry developed. And indoor environmental professionals that do mold investigations, they're very, very good at doing that portion of the work. They're looking
Yes.
for moisture, they're looking for mold growth, they're looking for corrective actions, they're looking at the indoor air for elevated mold spores. They do a
Yeah.
good job at that and they're fixing that. The
Right.
confusion is the homeowner is looking for something else. Their
Right.
question is something else, but they don't really understand that when they're calling to say, hey, I need someone to come look at this home to see if there's mold there. Usually the question's framed in a way that, oh, it's a traditional mold inspection. And the homeowner is thinking something else, aren't they, Andy?
They are. It took me a little while to figure that out, but for sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So the first part of my framework is really understanding what the hazard is. All right. And it's important for people to understand there are two hazards when it comes to mold. As you know, there's the biological, the actual mold itself, the spores that molds produce, the hyphal fragments, all these things are alive. Now,
Right.
some types of mold, under certain situations can produce mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are a poisonous chemical. So one
Sure.
is biological, the other one is chemical. One's
Yes.
alive, one is not. And so that's really where the challenge is to understand that we're dealing with two hazards when it comes to mold.
That is really profound, Mark. And I appreciate you saying that because when I initially went to my doctor and I said, I think that I have mold in my home making me sick, and I was dealing with neurological manifestations from mycotoxins, and my doctor didn't understand the toxicity part. And so wanted to test me for mold allergies. Well, I don't have allergies to mold. I don't have allergies to the biological aspect of mold. My problem was from, a chemical exposure. And so I think that distinction is really relevant both in the built environment, but also in our healthcare system. And unfortunately, there is a great lack of understanding in both spaces in that regard.
Yeah, and it's changing. People are becoming more and more educated,
Thank God.
you know, and that's why the exposure framework was put together, was to organize things in a structure so people can understand it and make sure that they're asking the right question. Because it doesn't start with the test. It starts, as you and I have talked about many times, it starts with the question.
Agreed. Agreed. Data points are just data points. And without a very clear objective understanding what part of the organism you're looking at and where it exists in the built environment is really important. And it's oftentimes a mistake I see families like my own make is they collect data points without having that understanding, and why I'm very excited about your exposure framework. It makes sense to me. So instead of taking all these data points and putting them into a bucket, we are organizing our thoughts and our data. Can you expand more on that? Because I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, the exposure framework is basically follows environmental science, okay? Exposure inside a home or structure. And so what it looks at is the hazard, the pathway, the domain, timing, and then verification. In homeowners terms, what does that mean? Okay. It's basically, we can break that down to what is it, biological or chemical? Are we breathing it? That's the exposure pathway. Domain, what are we looking at? Are we looking at air, surface, dust when we're doing evaluations for testing? Timing, is it current or is it historical? And
Okay.
then, was the problem resolved? All right. That's kind of the homeowner language. And that's what we want to look at when we're looking at a structure. First of all, what's the hazard? Biological or chemical or both? And for a homeowner or for anybody, clinician, indoor environmental professional, it all starts, as you know, Andy, with a thorough investigation of the home. We want to make sure that there is no current and ongoing mold issue. We want to
Sure.
correct that.
So, Mark, if you knew what you know now and you were still doing investigations, and I called you and I said, Mr. Ritacco, I think my house is making me sick, what would you recommend?
I would recommend calling someone else. No, I'm just kidding. Basically, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that that person who's doing the investigation also understands how to investigate for mycotoxin exposure investigation. So they need to be
Yes.
able to do both. So if you call somebody up and they don't believe in mycotoxins as an issue, that's not the person you want to work with. You need someone.
Agreed.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that they're not good at doing mold and mold remediation and investigations. They just don't have the training or experience at this time to do the mycotoxin exposure investigation. They're different. And
I would agree with that. And if I could just interject, when the way that I came to be with this company and with you is I was feeling very sick in a certain part of my home, and I was convinced that I was being exposed to mycotoxins. And the professional that I was working with used all the tools, all the foundational tools, thermal imaging, moisture meters, particle counters. We did spore trap air samples, even wall cavity samples, and nothing confirmed an issue. Luckily, I was working with somebody that believed me when I said, I feel off in this room. And very fortunate that that professional had access to Respiratory Labs technology. And it was actually the AMEA, the Airborne Mycotoxin Environmental Analysis, that confirmed that there was indeed an issue, which of course led us to finding very hidden water damage. So I prefer to find a professional that understands mycotoxins and has the ability to test for those things if it's needed.
Yeah, it's important that they have all the different tools because you and I have talked extensively at length. There is no single test that'll answer everything. You need
No,
an environmental professional that understands the different tests out there and what they can and cannot answer. We
right.
have some tests for airborne mycotoxins, but it has limitations just like all the other tests out there. I wish it would answer everything. It doesn't, but it's part of the investigation to see if there's an exposure pathway. It makes a
Right,
difference because it then changes the scope of the remediation and corrective action. So,
right.
more importantly than anything else, is the first question is it chemical or biological? And then when you're working with an environmental professional, make sure they have all the tools available and that they actually believe in those tools because some
Right.
of them have access to things, but they don't believe in it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eh,
So that's all.
can you imagine if there was a test or a machine that could just diagnose all the issues in our body? I've definitely seen sci-fi movies like that. And I think people sometimes expect that the same out of environmental testing. But really, a good indoor environmental professional, in my opinion, is one that's truly a clinician of the built environment. And again, understanding what each test tells us, what it doesn't, whether it's hazards, if it's historical, present, and also, you touched on pathway a lot. And I think that's really important because we know that presence doesn't always equate to exposure. And I think that's really important that we have that conversation.
Yeah, we'll probably do that in podcast number two. Uh,
Sounds
so,
good.
what I would probably leave with homeowners more than anything else, and understand that if you end up being concerned, is this home making me sick? That is not a biological question. That is a mycotoxin chemical question, usually, because usually you're sick inside the environment. And, it's very clear if you understand, Andy, and maybe let's touch on this really quick.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that mold growth health hazards versus a mycotoxin exposure health hazard? Just a couple quick things that
Sure.
you can identify the difference for
Yeah.
a homeowner.
Well, this is a good topic, and I wish allopathic doctors understood this. There's three very distinct pathways to disease in humans from fungi and mold. Mold acting as an allergen, biological. Mold acting as a pathogen, so like a fungal infection, also biological. And then mold acting as a toxin. These toxins are not biological; they are not alive. So three very different pathways. I personally do not have a mold allergy. So my symptoms from mold exposure are very neurological, immune complex. And so for me, that's my focus is the mycotoxins and then of course how I'm being exposed to them.
Yeah. So when you're looking at a home and you're talking about health issues and so forth, you'll have some people, well, I'm sneezing, coughing. Well, that's usually like an allergy like symptom,
Yeah.
like people have experience with pollen or pet dander, which
Yeah.
is completely different than someone says, I'm just disoriented. I got brain fog. I'm
Mhm.
fatigued all the time. Those aren't an allergy type experience. So it's a little bit different. So a good indoor environmental professional will have a checklist of questions that they're asking that helps them with their investigation. Am I dealing with just a mold investigation or am I dealing with mold investigation plus a
Okay.
mycotoxin exposure investigation? So it allows them to do their job a little bit. But as a homeowner, you really need to basically let that investigator know I'm concerned about mycotoxin exposure. So I want my
Right.
home evaluated for current biological, but I also want to make sure that the home is being evaluated for an exposure pathway to mycotoxins. So hazard,
Agreed.
biological, chemical, just make sure you understand the difference and make sure that you're communicating with the indoor environmental professional. And that's the frustrating part because you're in Facebook groups, you're in talking to all these different people. You would anticipate that the mold investigator is inspecting for both, but
No.
that's not how they've been trained in this industry. And you still have some associations that don't even believe in mycotoxin exposure.
It's frustrating and you nailed it. Everything's so compartmentalized. And so, families like mine, they hear mold, mycotoxins, air testing, dust testing. And sometimes it can seem like all of those data points diverge, but it's not necessarily that they diverge. They're just looking at different pieces to the puzzle. And I think that's really important to understand. And sometimes a mold investigation can identify where the mycotoxin exposure is coming from. And I think my situation was a little bit different. There was no visible mold. There was no musty odors. There was no obvious water damage. The only indicator that I had that something was amiss in that area of my home was simply how I felt when I went in there and was breathing the air in that room. So they're not interchangeable and important to be able to look at the whole picture and use those data points appropriately.
Yeah, it's people look at and they want things to just line up. I got a
It'd be nice.
biomarker. I've been sick for years, okay, and they're frustrated. And
Mhm.
all of a sudden, they go to the doctor. The doctor says, "Hey, let's do a test for mycotoxins." They get that test result back. It highlights mycotoxins as elevated. They immediately go to their home. Maybe they order online a dust test. Okay. It doesn't show mycotoxins, or maybe it does. All of a sudden, things start to align, but they're discussing different things. All right.
Yep.
Dust test is going to tell you one thing, an air test is going to tell you something else, and a medical test will tell you something else. They're not meant to align like we want them to, like those puzzles trying to fit together. Wouldn't that be nice if they did? But they don't. They're all going to lead you to a full investigation to decide what the next steps are. But it starts with the question.
And that's why I really appreciate your alignment, your exposure framework. It really makes that clear. And by the way, Mark, I would love if you told our listeners about the piece of work that you've been working so hard on that I think is going to be such a great resource to homeowners that are faced with these topics.
So, much to my wife's pleasure, I've been writing a book for homeowners, basically understanding the exposure framework, kind of to break it down into simple terms what the hazard is. What is it? Are we breathing it? Where is it? Timing, all those different things that are important. So I wrote a book called Are You Breathing It? Talks about mold, mycotoxins, and exposure. Okay. Because everything really starts with exposure. How do mycotoxins come in? How are we being exposed to it? And so understanding how all these different tests interact, what a biomarker is, how to interpret that, what ERMI testing is, what air testing is, and again, trying to put that into alignment to bring clarity, because more testing isn't necessarily the answer. It's the correct testing that'll bring clarity in the answers. So, Are You Breathing It? It's currently on Amazon. It's free for those that have Amazon Unlimited. Take your time, read it. I think you'll find that it's a lot of useful information for homeowners who are trying to navigate all these different tests. Because, like Tammy, all right, she had mold remediation done. She was still sick inside of her home, and the remediator said, I did my job correctly. I removed all the mold, but she's
Yep.
still sick from the mycotoxins. And so, why is that disalignment? Well, the remediator did his job correctly for what he was called to do. It was just the wrong question.
Right. I'm a fan of objective-based testing, Mark. Obtain exactly the question that you hope to have answered, because each data point, each test is going to answer a different question, and your book is going to be a wonderful resource. Are You Breathing It on Amazon, free for download on Kindle, I believe, and it's going to be such a great tool for homeowners. Also, if any of our listeners are wondering what test is most appropriate for their specific situation, you can reach out to our support team. That's me. And I would love to jump on a call and help anybody work through those questions. Thanks for being here and listening. And on our next episode, we are going to talk about exposure pathways and why that matters.